Thanks so much, Anjan. It's lovely to be here. I got back this morning from an overseas trip and was thrashing around trying to think of where I should begin in terms of some context. And my mind went back to, I think it must have been 1986 when I was in school. And I was attending a program at the Rotary House of Friendship. My dad was a member. And it was some kind of International Students' Day, and there was a group of African students who had been invited, apart from all the usual. And in particular, I got, as a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old then, I got started on a conversation with about 4 or 5 students from Burkina Faso, Burkinabe. And they had just recently been renamed Burkina Faso by, a socialist leader who was known as the Che Guevara of Africa, a gentleman, army officer by the name of Thomas Sankara. And I recall very clearly about how excited they were. Actually, I can still remember that conversation. And then I met one of them a few months later, sadly, by which time Sankara had been killed in office, and Africa had reverted to its usual mess, right? And I asked him, I said, what defines, I just remember this, I clearly remember this. I said, so what happened? What's happening in things? And he says, it's just death with unusual circumstances, right? And Sankara was an example of that. And there are several of them, of course, starting all the way back with Patrice Lumumba and several others. I want to just kick this off with a. This is the copy of the book, Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime from Anjan. I just want to begin with some context, and I'm reading one section. I'll pass this on to you afterwards. You'll have to help me with the French. Yeah? Réconciliation nationale, he replied. For the conflicts between people of the savannah and the river and of the north and the south, the Republic, that's a reference to the Central African Republic, had suffered 5 coups and various foul play since its independence from France in 1960. Barthélemy, am I pronouncing that right? Barthélemy Boganda, the country's independence hero, had died in a mysterious plane crash, some say planned by the French. His successor, David Dacko, was ousted in 1965. His successor, Jean Bedel Bokassa, was ousted in 1979 by the French, who flew Dacko back to Bangui and reinstalled him as president. Dacko was ousted a second time by General André Kolingba, who organized elections in which Anjan Félix Patasse was elected, only to be himself ousted in 2003 by the former Army Chief of Staff, François Bozize, who was then overthrown by the Seleka rebellion in 2013. For decades, the country had been in a state of perennial rebellion. Women are the peacemakers, I asked. It's more abstract, theory said. Each tress represents a different identity. The sculpture was profound. Women embraced strands of identity as the necessary elements to create a peaceful union. If I could just ask you, and to kick this off, Anjan, what got you to the Central African Republic? The immediate getting to and the years before that. Maybe we can break that up. Let's deal with the immediate getting to that's dealt with in the book.
So thanks for having me, and I don't think we need these mics, but they've told us for the recording that we need them.
Yes, please.
So we'll speak into the mics. So yes, a lot of things that you've mentioned or opened there. I guess the Central African Republic, the reason I went was I was in Canada with my daughter, who's here at the back. I read that, or a friend told me that, there were reports of ethnic cleansing, possibly genocide, but it was hardly in the news. At the same time, Syria was on the front pages of the newspapers. And this is quite common. There's always some other conflict that's more important. And even those conflicts don't get enough press, So even Ukraine, for example, now you don't hear about it so often. I was there last month, and they feel like they've been abandoned by the world's media, even though they get more press than most other conflicts, say the Central African Republic or Congo. And so I heard these reports, and it wasn't being sort of published. And with a friend, we made a plan. A friend who works at Human Rights Watch, his name is Lewis, and much of the book follows my journey with Lewis through the Central African Republic. We're going in to document massacres that have happened, are about to happen, or happening as we drive through. And most of these, crimes weren't widely known, and not known even beyond the little area in which they were happening. And so Lewis's mission, he was a researcher for Human Rights Watch, this American NGO, and his mission was to document the war crimes to somewhat of a legal level, so that later human rights courts can pursue the perpetrators, who often go scot-free, right? And my job was to tell the stories of these conflicts and sort of make it more widely known what was going on here and raise awareness. So really, that's really what sparked the journey. And by the time I went into this conflict, I'd been reporting in Central Africa for about 8 years, so I had a bunch of contacts, and it wasn't so complicated to organize.
We'll come to that in a minute. We'll talk a little bit about your stuff in the Congo and the rest. But on the way in which you got to the Central African Republic from the coast, right? It was in Canada, right?
Yes.
That's right. Okay. I'm going to read another small section, if you don't mind, because just to preface that, I should say that the session, the whole idea about your travails through Central Africa and the problems and all the stuff that you saw begins in the book with a very poignant, if I can say, connection in the family, in yourself and your wife and daughter. And so that's what I just wanted to just read this portion. Bangi, 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 she said, repeating the word in different tones to make music. You'll call me. She had found only a few books about the Central African Republic, mostly aimed at academics. It's as if this country doesn't exist for the average reader. No wonder so few people know about this war. Why is that, do you think? It feels so far away, she said. My man, you come home safe. Then she cackled, laughed. I've made you nervous, she said. She spoke about a book, and I won't say the French, called Dictators' Wives, a feminist retelling that restored the centrality of dictators' wives who'd been erased from history. She told me about the former Central African president, João Badal Bokassa, who had proclaimed himself emperor, and thus the Central African Republic an empire. His wife and France had fed his delusions, organizing a coronation like Napoleon's, with white horses and antique Napoleonic swords provided by the Saint-Cyr, the French military college in Paris. Bokassa had been toppled after murdering nearly 100 children in Bangui. He then anointed himself the 13th apostle of Jesus, and he had died in 1996. I felt the anxiety in her idle chatter. I settled firm in my seat, wary that an explosion might follow. She asked for a gift. She wanted something pretty. The Central African Republic was known for sculptors who carved ebony necklaces and engraved calabashes. I'd heard of its famous tableau, colleges of tropical butterfly wings, so on and so forth. How did you reconcile that in your own mind? The stuff that this nation, oddly called the Central African Republic, right? That itself is an oddity from whatever I've read. How does that sit with what you then saw as you entered Bangui and then you started going? I noted that there were 3 or 4 main massacre areas that you went to. But the idea that there is this fairly ancient pre-colonial culture that exists, how, as you went from the personal, so to speak, into Bangui?
So I guess, yes, to comment on the name. So you mentioned Barthélemy Boganda, who was the Central African Republic's independence hero. And he gave the Central African Republic this name because he envisioned when the Central African Republic would obtain independence from French colonial rule, he envisioned the CAR as one state in a United States of Africa, which he felt was necessary to hold back and push back the West, because he was worried that as African states got independence and each one on its own would be exploited in new ways, which is what happened. And he unfortunately was killed in 1959 in a plane crash that many say was, organized. It's widely believed it was organized by the French, who were nervous about him leading the country to independence. But there's no conclusive proof of who organized that plane crash. But I guess, having lived in Central Africa, in Congo and Rwanda, and then the Central African Republic for about 10 years, the sense of contradiction wasn't so sort of stark in my mind. One of the main reasons that I travel to these places, well, there are a few reasons, but a couple of the main reasons is first to raise the profile of these conflicts in the global consciousness in different ways, through the media, through writing, and talking and articles and so on. And another, personally, at a personal level, is to, what drives me and what motivates me is the people that I find there. Usually, almost every conflict that I've reported on these front lines, in the places where you think, it might seem the most hopeless place, you find incredible people doing, inspirational work. And in the Central African Republic, for example, there was... in the west of the country, I traveled to the west where there were, it's one of the massacre zones that you mentioned. And there was a Polish abbot who ran the cathedral there. And I showed up, Louis and I showed up with Thierry. So we were three in the group. We were Louis, who was the Human Rights Watch researcher, an American guy. Thierry Mesongo, who was a Central African reporter, who was our fixer. But really, he was central to the whole mission because he knew his country better than any of us. And he was kind of leading us through. And it was myself, and we had a driver. And so we arrived at this cathedral in the west of the country at this place called Boar, which used to be a French military airport. Very beautiful place, and it's very ancient civilization as well. There are monoliths there from thousands of years old. And we arrive at this cathedral, and the Polish abbot says he's going to drive the next day about 200 kilometers north to the site of a massacre where a church had been attacked. A town had been attacked. Maybe 100 people had been killed, but we didn't know how many. The church had been attacked, and the soldiers had stolen the doors of the church for wood. And so he said the priest is now sleeping in the open, and the altar is now in the open. And he said, I can't let this pass without some kind of show of support. So I'm going to travel up there with a new door. And I've had a new door built, and I'm going to take it in my pickup truck, and we're going to drive up through this rebel zone and fix this new door. And I'm going to show the soldiers who are there that this priest has support. And so I found this extraordinary, that this guy would take such risk to fix a door, and for this kind of moral support. And so I asked if we could join him, and he said fine. So we joined his convoy. And on our way, he hadn't mentioned this, but on our way, he would stop in the rebel zone. He would stop at village after village. And he would arrive in the pickup truck, and the village would be empty because upon hearing our engine, people would run away and they would think it's the army come to attack them again. And so they would run into the forests and they would just hide. And so he would get there and he would honk 3 times, or he had a signal. And somebody would run out of the forest and shove a piece of paper through the window into my lap. And there would be a list of people who were sick, who needed medicine, who had been killed, all the needs of the village. And so the abbot went from town to town, collected these pieces of paper, and I should mention the phone antenna had all been destroyed by the government. There was no way to communicate out of this war zone. All this in the 21st century. We think we're inundated by information, but there are huge swaths of the world in places like this where there are, great needs, where there's no way to communicate. So it relies on the bravery and courage of people like this abbot to drive through. And so we reached the town, we fixed the door, we met the priest. They told us about the massacre, we documented it. And when we came back, the abbot handed all those pages to the NGOs in Boar, in the main capital, in the provincial capital, so they would know who needed help, where to send supplies, where to send medicines. It's quite extraordinary that he was doing crucial work and nobody knew about him. He didn't seek any publicity, and he was really doing what journalism should be doing, which is sort of reporting, collecting information, and raising the profile of these needs. And so that's really what motivates me. And time, I now live in Mexico, where I report on indigenous communities who are defending their ecosystems, their land, their mountains, rivers, and forests against cartels, private companies, governments that want to extract natural resources from their territory. And in many cases, these indigenous communities, they try to mount legal battles, legal challenges. They don't work. And then finally, I'm traveling to many communities where they're fighting drone wars. They've armed themselves, anti-aircraft guns, heavy weapons, drones, and they're shooting down cartel drones. And these communities are usually 1,000 people. They're only 1,000 people, and they're fighting some of the most powerful forces in the world. So it's inspirational kind of figures and communities like this that really drive my work. So yeah, there's sort of no real contradiction in my mind, that there's immense beauty, immense courage, immense inspiration, but what gets reported often, or what gets emphasized, is sort of the mess of it all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But just tell us a little bit about the locals, right? You met a number of them. There's the child soldier. There's the gentleman whose name I now forget, who dies of malaria, right? Right.
So our driver, yes. So there are a number of people, like maybe a dozen people I met on this journey, died in a few months after I met them. So our driver, the driver I mentioned, his name is Suleiman. He drove us through most of our journey, and then we realized he was a spy. So we had to sort of change drivers. But he was a good guy. He was doing what all of us would do. He was trying to protect his community in this war, and we were traveling into places where almost no one was traveling. And so he was obtaining access to information. He was seeing things that were it was war intelligence. It was sort of really valuable intelligence, and he, like anybody, he started to communicate this to his people and tell them who was organizing what campaign and what attack. And so we discovered that he was doing this, and so we had to switch him. But a few months after we left, he contracted malaria, and again there's no access to medicines, or it's extremely restricted. So he wasn't, even him with a fancy car that drove us all around the country. He was a former soldier. Even he couldn't get access to anti-malarial medication, which is quite, commonly available. And so just basic medication. And so he died. And we had 3 or 4 kids. This child soldier we met in one of the first places we went to, 14 years old. He called himself Tony Montana because he said he wanted to be cruel, like the guy like Al Pacino in Scarface. And he was basically being used by the local, the commander, army commander in that area, to torture, potential or suspected spies. And this kid had immense power, and he was killed a few months later when the rebels sort of took over their army base. There was one town where a local priest and an imam gave us shelter in the majlis. We slept over there overnight.
Is that one name, the place called Bohong? Or was I?
No, Bohong was the massacre where the abbot replaced the door.
Right. Okay.
This place was called Bekadilli.
Bekadilli. Okay.
Yeah, we slept in the majlis. So we were sleeping on the ground with tying up mosquito nets. And so the imam and the priest had given us shelter. And after another priest had kicked us out, saying, we're not a hotel in the middle of a war. We're not here to give shelter to random people. But these people, this little town, they gave us shelter. And they were both killed. Both the priest and the imam were killed in different waves of attacks. So it was kind of, when I was writing the book, I was sort of going through the list of all the people I had mentioned and calling up friends, calling up the reporter, calling up Thierry to ask what had happened to them. And it was stunning how many people had been killed in just a few months, and people who had helped us, whom we'd traveled with or engaged with in quite intimate ways, and sort of who'd saved our lives or helped us. Every act of human kindness over there is essential. Otherwise, you don't get out alive. And so, to hear that they had not gotten out alive was sort of tragic, but sort of part of the war.
So there is also in your travels, and then there's this reference to, it's clearly not in the capital, right? It's called Camp. Right? Camp.
There's a town called Kombongi.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
Camp Bongi, but Kombongi.
Okay,
Yeah.
Where I think that's when you encountered these structures in or whatever remains of it, in terms of this divide between the Muslim and the Christian thing, right? There is General Hamad, am I right in it, right? And there is, again, the name I don't remember right off the top of my head, but there was there are those power centers that exist as well, right? So how did you traverse through that? How did you see it, and how did you relate to it? Especially, that Kompongi, right, where there's clearly there's some attempt to try and reach. Is it a settlement, or was it more? What was going on?
So I can give a general sort of brief introduction to the war. So what happened in 2013 was the Central African Republic has been mostly Christian. It's majority Christian. It's been mostly Christian for the last 100 years. But prior to that, it was part of Muslim sultanates that ruled over the area. That were defeated by the French. The French installed the French colonial sort of authority, and then the Central African Republic got independence, and then since then it's been mostly Christian sort of leaders. In 2013, a group of Muslim rebels, wanting to recapture or regain their old glory, they set off from the north of the country in a little convoy, and they took over the capital, and they took over the country.
This is the Selaka forces.
Yeah, it's called Seleka. It's sort of Seleka means the alliance. It was a loose alliance of a few rebel groups, and they took over the country. But while they were strong enough to take over the country because the government was so weak, they weren't strong enough to govern the country. So they governed the capital, Bangi, but most of the rest of the country was sort of chaos, or had little factions, little fiefdoms run by local commanders, generals who ran those areas like their own little countries, sovereign territories. And so we realized this when we arrived at the front line of the war, when we arrived on this hill where there was a government base, and I was having this kind of surreal conversations with
A place called
Gaga. We arrived in a place called Gaga, and sort of it was a government base. It was the front line of the battle between. Sorry. I should mention that once the government took over and these commanders ran their little fiefdoms, the Christian majority of the country rose up. They sort of armed themselves with artisanal weapons, and they said, we're going to fight back. But at this point, when I arrived, there were still sort of ragtag little rebel groups. And so we arrived at this front line where the government was facing one of these rebel contingents. And I had this surreal conversation where I sat down with the army commanders, and they asked me where I was from, and I said India and whatever. They were like, and I said I grew up in Dubai, and they were like, oh God, you grew up in Dubai? Wow! Can you get us an excavator? One of those tractors. And they said, if you can get us an excavator to here, we'll give you half this mountain, because the mountain we're sitting on is full of gold. We'll give you half the mountain that's for you, and we'll take the other half. And so there's all these gold mines that these different groups are fighting over. And while we were there, what happened was the rebel group, the Christian majority rebel group, had arrived almost at this camp where we were sitting. And a general showed up, a government general, and scolded the commander for allowing the rebels to come so close. And so the government set out. We saw this government soldiers set out on a convoy of motorcycles to go and defeat these rebels. And we tried to follow them, but the soldiers said, no, you can't come in, it's not allowed. Because obviously they were going to commit war crimes. So we tried to follow them afterwards, and it was too deep into the jungle. But then somebody in the town told us that from Bekadili, where the imam and the priest allowed us to stay for a night, they said from there's an alternate route into this place called Kombongi, which is where the government and the rebels were going to fight, and there was going to be this huge, battle. And we had to wait a couple of days because the battle happened, and nobody knew what had happened because, again, there's no information, and people are too scared to speak. People are too scared to speak because if they're caught informing, then they get killed. And so we drove in on a motorcycle convoy from this town, Piccadilly. We traveled like 3 hours through the jungle and these elephant grass. And we arrived at the town. We found the entire town burned down. So what had happened was the soldiers had arrived in this town. The rebels had fought them off, and the government got desperate because they were going to lose the battle. And so they just said, scorched earth, we're just going to burn this town down and make it uninhabitable for local people. And so it was, within a few days of setting out from Bangi that we arrived in this place. It was a war crime. It was a massacre. It was, contravened international law in every kind of way. But it hadn't been documented at all, and nobody, even half an hour away from that town, on our way in, the people in another village, they didn't know what had happened there. And so we, spent a few hours documenting as much as we could to get back. We got back in the dark, but the idea is to get back before dark because it's safer. So I can't remember your question now, but this is kind of the kind of work we were trying to do.
Not so much a question, but the point was at that Camp Bangi. So that was really a transit point, you were saying, to get to this the place where you could document this massive.
Well, so each of these, we were traveling, we were getting these little reports on the radio through Theory, our fixer, who had this network of local reporters who were too scared, who had all this information, but were too scared to publish it because they might get targeted. So Theory was telling us, calling his friends and, giving us information. There might be a massacre here. We don't know because nobody's gone in. There might have been a war crime here. We don't know because it's too dangerous to report. And so we would get this information. We would try to get as close as we could to these sites of, war crimes and try and document them. And we were never sure if we would get to these places in Boar and Bohong, where the Polish abbot was there. Thanks to the Polish abbot and his authority, we were able to get from Boar to Bohong to the sites of the massacres. But usually you rely on someone local like that. You need someone, you can't just drive in. It's too dangerous. Somebody catches you, somebody asks a question, they get nervous. And this is what happened at the end of the book. Close to the end, sort of 2/3 of the way in, we reported on the government's crimes in the first half, and then we realized that these rebels, who were ragtag little groups, they suddenly become really powerful, and they suddenly united around the country and become really powerful. And so we went to their headquarters, where they were planning a genocide of the Muslims, because they said, the Muslims are the minority, they've forgotten their place in the country. They don't know, before we used to live in harmony, but that was because the Christians were in charge. And now they've forgotten their place in the country, and now they're trying to be in charge. And so we're just going to get rid of them. We're going to commit a genocide and ethnic cleansing. And so, again, these were rumors, and we didn't know to what extent they were serious about their plans. And so we drove into the rebel headquarters. But unfortunately, we arrived on the same day that the government was planning an attack on that headquarters. So we arrived, and they stopped us. The rebel commander, the head of this whole rebel group called the Anti-Balaka, the commander stopped us on the road, said, "You're going to stand here in the sun because the government's coming. And if the government comes here, they're going to kill you first." So we stood there for about 3-4 hours and, a long conversation, trying to get out before the government arrived, because we would get caught in the crossfire and it would, be terrible. But we sort of, we had to negotiate. In that instance, we'd done our homework, and we had gone in with a rebel sort of guide who was a player on the national football team who turned himself into a rebel to fight for his, his people. So it's kind of crazy, all the little characters you meet along the way. But we arrived with this commander. The commander said, you're going to stay here. And I had to negotiate with the commander over those 3 hours to let us go. But in those 3 hours, we weren't sure. And at one point, as soon as we opened the door of our car, there were 300 rebels. There was a commander with his 300 rebels. They all pointed their guns at us. And after like half an hour, about half an hour in the sun, I asked him, "Hey, can we sit in the shade?" And he agreed. So we sat in the shade, and we started. You negotiate in these small ways. You try and get a little bit more power by asking him permission to sit in the shade. He relents a little bit. So then the conversation becomes a little more friendly, a little more human, a little more equal. And so we're sitting, and then at that point, we had just fired Suleiman, the driver who had been killed, who was a spy. But our new driver was also Muslim. His name was Yusuf. And so he was in the car. He didn't want to get out of the car because all these Christian rebels were around and they wanted to kill him, and they didn't know who he was. So he sat in the car while the three of us went into the shade under this big mango tree. And at one point, the rebels behind me, I could hear them move around, and they were like, "Let's just kill them." And at that point, I thought, this is it, because these guys are not even trained soldiers. They're, football players, pharmacists, bureaucrats, teachers. They've never been trained in chain of command and anything like that. If one of them shoots, it's over. We're all going to get killed. And so I didn't know what. For the moment, I thought, okay, this is it. I'm going to die under this mango tree, and they're going to throw me in a ditch, and nobody's going to find us for 3 months or something. And because even it was an area that rebel headquarters was so dangerous that even the French army, which was running the peacekeeping force over there, they didn't patrol that area because it was too dangerous. And so there was no way anybody was going to find us, and at least in my mind. But after I decided that it was okay if I died under that tree, I decided that I didn't want to die. And so I stood up and I said to the commander, "If anything happens to me or anybody with me, it's going to be really bad for you." And he looked me in the eye, I looked him in the eye, and for whatever reason, he believed me. And he told everyone, "Guns down," but they didn't put their guns down. And then at that point, somebody recognized Yusuf in the car. And they said, "Oh, I know him from the Muslim neighborhood in Bangui, the capital. I know that guy, he's Muslim." And they were like, they started to taunt him. They started to say, they were going to kill him. And it was super dangerous because we were in the middle of nowhere. There's no law, there's no nothing. It's totally, you're at the mercy of these rebels. So Yusuf looked over, and I called him over to sit on this log we were sitting on under the mango tree. I called him and asked him to sit next to me. He came and sat next to me, and he started to do his namaz. And at that point, he took my little finger and he held my little finger, and he finished his prayers, and he said, "I'm ready to go. I've said my prayers, I'm ready to go." And I was like, "You're not going anywhere, but nothing's going to happen." And at that point, when I argued with the commander, and the commander said, "You guys can go, but you can leave Yusuf behind." And so then Lewis, who was with me, said, "We're not going anywhere. We're either all going together or we're all staying." And the commander said, "Fine, you can all go." After a little more negotiation, he said, "You can all go, but we take everything in your car." And so they stripped our car clean or we had a 4-wheel drive, but they stripped it clean of everything, of our mattresses, mosquito nets, medicines. They're really poor, even though these guys are, deadly and genocidal. They're really poor. They have nothing. Their weapons are often handmade, and they took everything in the car. And then we drove out. And as we drove out, about maybe 40 minutes outside the headquarters, 4 or 5 government trucks, pickup trucks, filled with soldiers, armed to the teeth, passed us super fast, going the other way. And so we missed the battle by about 40, 45 minutes or something like that. We could hear the bombs go off behind us, and we just got out just in time. And after that, we saw more and more convoys come through. But these are kinds of sort of, trust games that you have to play when you're reporting from these conflict zones. And sometimes these conversations or agreements, they go wrong, because even though they trust you, they trusted us to allow us into their headquarters, which they wouldn't anybody. We arrived on the wrong day at the wrong time, and so we had to negotiate our way out of that. So the journey was really sort of many little episodes like this, trying to understand what was happening in the war, because there was no information, and piecing together a war through a journey that was really incredible, because nobody was traveling like this across the country. It was really too dangerous. And Lewis and I, somehow at that point, we had access. With Theory's help, we were able to get enough local people in each corner of the country to invite us to help, agree to help us. And so we were able to somehow build a map of the war at that time. and understand how the rebels, these rebels who nearly killed us, they eventually rose up in such numbers that they did cleanse the country of the Muslims. I think the numbers are kind of staggering. I think the population of the country was 4 million in total. Bangi was about 1 million. I think 80 or 90% of Muslims in the capital were cleansed, either killed or they left in these convoys to Cameroon. They sought refuge in the neighboring countries. Those who stayed and even took refuge in the mosques, they were killed in the mosques. But yeah, they were chased on the streets with knives and machetes. It was very public sort of maiming and public cleansing of the country in a very public way to say Muslims are not welcome here anymore. And we kind of witnessed and spoke to the rebels and hung out with them just as they were getting to that point where they were powerful enough to take over the country, even with their handmade weapons.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you make your way back to the capital. Maybe just for all of us, just give us a little, two parts to my question actually. One is, with all of this information and the stuff that you had documented, talk us a little bit about what you did and what's happened to all that documentation, and just place, just for the benefit of the audience as well. This is, I don't think people realize the scale of this country, the size of this country, right? And it's right in the heart of Africa. And just a little brief overview, because you essentially started down in the southwest, which is Bangi, is effectively on, I think it's on the border with Cameroon or Congo. And then you work your way up northwest, then northeast, and then back to almost like a circle.
Yeah, we did two loops, and there's a little
just
map.
Talk about that, and not so much in terms of the actual geographical thing, but just in terms of this. It's 4 million, but we're talking of a country the scale, the size of,
It's the size of France.
Yeah.
So the country is the size of France. The way the world map is drawn, this Mercator projection, it sort of skews our understanding of the size of these countries. So Central African Republic, which looks really small, is the size of France. Congo, which is where I first reported from in Central Africa, it's the size of all of Western Europe put together: Germany, France, Portugal, the UK, Spain, all put together. And just for context, when I arrived in Congo, I was 22 years old. I was one of 4 foreign correspondents there. And I wasn't even a foreign correspondent. I had no training and never published a journalistic piece in my life. But I was one of 4 foreigners there reporting on the country for the world. And the Central African Republic was kind of similar. There was, I think when I was there was one Guardian reporter, and he asked me if I knew any Central African reporters who spoke English, because he didn't speak French. And so it was kind of incredible that the Guardian would send somebody who didn't speak French to this completely francophone country. But this is the level at which international news reports on these places. But yeah, it's a huge country. We made kind of these 2 big loops as much as we could. When at the end of the journey, our journeys, the anti-Balaka, the rebel forces, were so strong and taking over that it got too dangerous, and we decided to leave. And so we were on the same flight out as one of the government commanders, one of the ministers who we'd interviewed on our way in, and it was too dangerous for him as well, because the rebels were going to come take over the capital. And so we were on that flight with him, and he was eventually, so to your point about all this documentation, he was indicted by a war crimes tribunal. So were others. This General Hamad, who burned down Kambangi, we documented that, Louis and I, and Louis documented that sort of for Human Rights Watch. There was a court case against him. He was, I believe, convicted. And I wrote a bunch of articles, wrote this book. Just for context, the Central African Republic, with this weird name that Buganda gave the country, hoping for a United States of Africa. When I asked editors if I could go there and report on it, they asked me which Central African Republic. And so they were unaware that this was the name of a country, even this was a country. And when I published this book, which was published last year, in India as well, it was published last year. it was the first time in 100 years that there's been a mainstream book aimed at the general population for about this country, an account, a travel account, or an account of the country. The last one was 1927 by André Gide. It was called Voyage au Congo, and in which he also traveled through the Central African Republic, also documenting the French and Belgian colonial regimes' crimes, colonial crimes at that time. But since then, there have been a couple of books. There's one called The Battle of Bangui. There's a great comic book by a Central African illustrator. But there's been no real book that's been published in a mainstream, in the US and mainstream markets in the US and the UK and India and stuff like that. And so it was really hard to publish this book. Even though I've published 2 other books previously, it was really hard because I had my publishers, they would call me up and say, there's no market for this country. Like I called my chief publicist or whatever. They were like, there's no record of any book sales for this country. Like we don't know how to market this. We don't know how to sell this. So it's really hard to convince them that this was worth publishing, that this account was. But for me, it was meaningful in that way because for me it was extending literature in some way.
So, in fact, the Central African Republic is it's not simply called a failed state, it's called a phantom state. It doesn't exist. So if I can just now take you back a little bit to the other failed state that you first reported on, right? Which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? And I know it's not in this book, and there's a previous one which I just laid my hands on. So tell us a little bit about your story to begin with in that what is effectively Africa's world war, isn't it? In fact, there's several books written on that. It certainly has received much more, attention in terms of writing, right? And I think because of the sheer size of the country, and the various personages and all the neighboring countries that are involved. But tell us a little bit about your experience there, because you had that before in the DRC, and of course your time in Rwanda. Right.
Right. So I guess I don't know where to start. So I arrived
maybe in the DRC.
In the DRC, I arrived in DRC. I was 22 years old. I just graduated from university. I'd studied mathematics. I just turned down this job at Goldman Sachs as a quant, as a mathematician over there, and I showed up in the DRC, and I had no reporting experience, but the AP, the Associated Press, the U.S. news agency, the Wire agency, they kind of said, we'll look at whatever you send us, and we'll pay you by the word. So we'll pay you 10 US cents per published word. Not every word that you send us, but what we publish. And there's no health insurance, there's no protection, there's nothing. So, but if we like it, we'll publish it and we'll pay you. And the AP obviously has this huge reach. The DRC, you're right, it has received more attention, especially in a literary sense, because of The Heart of Darkness with Joseph Conrad, and there's a whole tradition in literature about Congo. But relative to the size of the war, it's killed. When I went there in 2005, it was 4 million people had been killed by the war and war kind of related causes. Now it's close to 6 million. Relative to that scale, it receives nowhere near the attention that it should. So I arrived there. I had this idea that this war should be on the front page of the newspaper. When I was at university at Yale in the States, I studied over there. I'd studied mathematics, and before that, I'd studied at IIT over here. I'd been in electrical engineering for 1 year, and I left. But I'd read in the newspaper, there was a little article. This is what made me go to Congo, or one of the reasons. I opened the New York Times, and there in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a little article about Congo war. Something had happened, and they said 4 million people had died. And I blew my mind that this was in the middle of the newspaper at the bottom of the page and wasn't on the front page. So this idea that I had was to go to Congo and try to report and see what this was about. What's going on here? Why is no one talking about it? And I was curious. And a lot of the book is the book Stringer, which is my first book, which was about my journey, sort of becoming a journalist. It's a coming of age story. About my experience becoming a journalist, trying to understand what kind of stories make the news. I was trying to sell the news to survive. I was staying with a Congolese family, trying to pay my rent, and trying to sell stories to pay my rent. But along the way, I kind of began to understand that some stories make the news. A plane crash, a boat sinking always makes the news, but a lot of other stories don't make the news. One of those examples was I heard in the radio every morning. I would wake up, listen to the radio, and try to see what was happening and try to see if there was some news that I could pitch. And so one morning I woke up and I heard the radio, and there was this huge protest. There were all these women outside a UN base in Kisangani, I believe it was. And all these women were protesting. There was an epidemic of rape by various people, but also allegedly by UN officers. And none of this had been investigated. None of this had been, prosecuted. And so these women were protesting that a bunch of them had been raped, and there was no action, no justice. So I called my editor at the AP, and he was like, "Any shooting?" I was like, "No." He's like, "Anybody killed?" I was like, "No." And he said, "Local baseball, we're not interested." And so this was one of the top news items in Congo on that day, and all the Congolese were talking about it, about how the UN was doing this, the UN wasn't taking action. But for international news, it just wasn't seen as important partly because so many killings had occurred in Congo, 4 million dead, 5 million dead, that the deaths had to be special and had to have occurred on some huge scale for it to be interesting to the news. And so as a 22-year-old trying to sell the news and trying to sort of understand the news, I was trying to figure out why, not only how to make a living, but why this was the case. And that was the beginning of my sort of investigation of the international news system, trying to understand how it operates. And then 10 years later, I did my PhD on this topic, on post-colonial news, on the colonial news structure of international news. And you kind of realize that international news is incredibly colonial, that many traditions from colonial times are still embedded in the international news. It's still sort of, foreign correspondents are sent out from global capitals like New York and London. They're sent out to the peripheries of the world. They often extract information from local reporters like Thierry, who traveled with us, who know the country really well. The foreign correspondents extract this information, transform it, send it back to their countries, get all the money, get all the Pulitzer Prizes and whatever, all the credit. And this mirrors sort of what happened during colonial rule with raw materials, with textiles, with cotton, with whatever. And so that structure is still in place. And I think having understood this, and a lot of people complain that the Western news doesn't give enough importance to Congolese lives or Indian lives or Cambodian lives. I sort of think that we're at a very interesting point now, where countries like India and Kenya and Nigeria are wealthy enough that we do have, I think, the capacity in our news systems to begin to report on the world, but we don't. I don't know why we don't do it. But for example, if an Indian wants to understand something about Cambodia, often the news needs to travel from Cambodia to London and then come back here. There's very few Indian correspondents. There's very little sustained Indian presence in Cambodia, even though India and Cambodia have huge trade ties, historical ties. Same in Africa. India, you were just in Nairobi. The economy in Kenya is half of it is run by people of Indian descent. But there's hardly any Indian presence diplomatically or in terms of the news. It's just not seen as important. And news from Kenya, if it needs to reach India, it probably goes to London, New York, and comes to India. So I think that needs to change. And I think once that changes, I think we'll start to see really interesting dynamics where I think intrinsically an Indian audience does value Cambodian lives or African lives in a different way. And I think, maybe a Nigerian audience will value a Central African life in a different way. And we'll start to see this once we start to see the media expand, become more international, but it's not been the case so far.
Okay. I'm just going to end on this conversation with a simple question. What's next, and what's the outlook for you? I know you live in Mexico, but will Africa draw you back?
I don't know, maybe in the future. I'm now in Mexico, and I think it's really powerful what I'm living through there. I moved there because 3 years ago I read that Mexico was the deadliest country for environmental defenders. So 54 defenders, most of them indigenous, had been killed in Mexico. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia are the three, hotspots, deadliest countries. Usually they trade places every year for environmental defenders. And I think, having reported for 10 years from Central Africa, in Rwanda I reported on dictatorship, on sort of repression of free speech, destruction of free speech there. That's another story. But I reported, having reported on conflicts in Central Africa for a while, I thought the greatest conflict, and I think the most important conflict of our time now, is the environmental conflict, the war that our societies are waging on the environment. And there's an incredible statistic that 80% of our biodiversity globally is now being protected by only 5% of the world's population, which identifies as indigenous. So we've destroyed our biodiversity everywhere else. And now we're relying on these little indigenous communities that are, taking care of their territories and have done so for hundreds or thousands of years. And that's where 80% of our biodiversity is. And now our societies are coming for that territory. Where in Mexico, many of these indigenous communities, they're being attacked by consortiums, by cartels, by soldiers, but in support of interests that are looking to extract minerals and resources, wood, gold, titanium, lithium, whatever you need for the green transition, for industrial transition. And I think something similar is happening here as well. I don't know all the details, but the Indian government is now going to Nicobar, and they're looking to develop that, and there's probably some extractive interest there as well.
Although if I can bring you back again for a minute to Africa, that's an important piece of that puzzle, right? In place, especially in the Congo, perhaps even in the Central African Republic.
Yes, Congo.
That this war between the communities and that's tearing these nations apart, making them phantom states, is actually promoted by a whole bunch of neighbors and other interests that are aimed at extracting all of this mineral wealth. I mean, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is perhaps the wealthiest nation in terms of sheer resources. But of course, none of that's seen by its own people. And extracted, like as you said, from colonial times all the way into this neo-colonial age. So that, again, if you look at it from that perspective of the environment, the attack on the environment, and these are communities that are not able to defend themselves physically today, with all of this conflict, sectarian and others. But
Congolese, they have this. What you say brings to mind this. Congolese have this legend that they tell each other, that when God created the world, sort of traveled the world with his bags of riches, and then he got tired and fell asleep, and he fell asleep in Congo and left all his bags there. So they have everything that you would need. And for the last 100 years, if you track sort of international technological progress and the exploitation of the Congo, they go hand in hand. So when the automobile was invented, the world needed rubber for tires. And the Belgian colonial authorities then, extracted rubber from Congo. There was committed something close to, I think 10 million people were killed, or some huge number. They cut off people's hands if they didn't collect enough rubber. That was in the automobile revolution. Then there was the electrical revolution. The world needed copper.
And not to forget the chocolate.
Back then. Yes.
Cocoa.
Yes. Well, West Africa. I have a friend who's doing interesting work on that now. But Unilever has been extracting cocoa and palm oil for a long time from Congo. But then to continue this technological story, then you had the electrical revolution. The world needed copper in the south of Congo, some of the largest copper deposits in the world. Yeah. And then, Lumumba was killed partly in that conflict because Congo was seeking independence at that time. And Lumumba wanted to unite the country. The Belgians wanted to keep control of the copper. And so Lumumba was killed. Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, was also killed, involved with that. Then the world had the electronics revolution. They needed electrical circuits. Congo has huge reserves of tin, which is used in the conducting elements in electronic circuits. Then the cell phone came along. Congo has tantalum, which is used in capacitors. And so there was, again, exploitation and war to extract tantalum. Now there's electric vehicles. Congo has cobalt. And so there's, again,
uranium.
also, Congo's uranium was used in sort of World War II in Little Boy and Fat Man, the two, first atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So yes, it just continues. And every time some new mineral is needed, these, like in Mexico with these cartels, in Congo, militias are, empowered, armed, financed by neighboring countries, by, international forces, and they control mines from which these materials are extracted. So yes, it's Congo somehow become a pawn, and so are these indigenous territories. So are indigenous territories all over the world that now hold all this biodiversity. They unfortunately get sacrificed in this in the name of technological progress and this the world's need for increasingly ever more natural resources and raw materials.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to now throw this open. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating tour through Africa. Sorry.
Hi. My question is actually about Mexico and your reporting there. Recently, there was this election in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum against social, and she's indigenous. So I wanted to get your sense of how that factor is playing out in Mexican politics, since you're reporting on those communities. And forgive my ignorance, this is as much as I know.
So Claudia Sheinbaum, who won the election, she's Jewish. She's not, Mexican indigenous. Interestingly, she was a climate scientist. She was in the IPCC panel. But, and she might change Mexico's policies to, move away from fossil fuels. But Mexico is a narco state, and it's probably going to continue. So she's going to probably continue this policy of extraction, of collusion with the cartels.
I was also asking about Social, who is the indigenous candidate that I think the party of former President Fox put up. So I was curious about how that played out in this, if that was how that plays out.
She didn't have much support, so it became a talking point at some point. But and all of the indigenous communities in Mexico, a few years ago they banded together and they put up a candidate, an indigenous candidate who was truly indigenous, supported by all the communities. And I don't think she won. She won maybe a couple of % of the vote, and it was I think an important symbolic exercise. But Mexico is a colonial society. It's a society where the colonial powers won, like the U.S., like Canada, and in Mexico, many of the indigenous communities are still exist and still have some kind of political role in the system. Unlike in the US and Canada, where they're sort of on their reservations and they have no power. But they're still, a minority. They still get, the huge crimes committed against them. There's no justice. They're sort of at the bottom rung of society. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. There's a
Hi.
question.
Two questions. One, I've read that's your second book, I think, Stringer. Stringer's the first one, right? So I know that you've worked in Africa for a long time. What is your sense that ethnic and religious markers may actually be symptoms of these kinds of global technological and capitalistic pressures that you're talking about? What is the relationship between them? If at all there's a localized civil war kind of situation which is actually cashing in on sort of Hutu and Tutsi or kind of any other kind of ethnic markers, are these in any way or in what way are they related to these global kind of pulls and pushes and pressures? Second question, I sense from having read your earlier book and having heard you speak here that from very early on, you had a sense of war being also attractive in some senses. There's a smell of war that is exciting for journalists across centuries and generations of journalists who've gone to war has been. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know that's a difficult question or provocative question, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
No problem. So the first question, absolutely. I think, these local tensions, there are divisions in every country. And I think there's interests. Often these local divisions are exploited, are sort of deepened, instigated, provoked by interests. And often those interests in these mineral-rich areas come from outside. So I'm not an expert on each one of them, But yes, I've seen in many of the places that I've reported that there's outside forces that are sort of stoking these flames, and there is an interest. For example, in the Central African Republic now, until last year, the Wagner Group in Russia had been very active, and so they were extracting minerals, and they were selling them on the black market, and they were Russia was using these Wagner sales. By some estimates, they were selling hundreds of millions of dollars or making hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were using these proceeds to circumvent sanctions and finance the Ukraine war. And so, yeah, the Central African Republic can seem super remote, but it's actually connected to some of the most central conflicts. So that's an example. Last year, Prigozhin was killed. Now Russia's taken over. Russia's and the Wagner Group's presence in the Central African Republic was itself filling a vacuum left by the French. So for 100 years before, the French had been in the Central African Republic extracting diamonds and ivory and gold and all kinds of minerals. And so at some point, the anti-colonial movement got powerful enough that the French were kind of kicked out. And the French military left. And then there was a void. And Russia said, we're going to move in. And that's when the Wagner Group came in. And now Prigozhin was killed. And recently there was a report that basically the Kremlin, Putin has taken over all of the Wagner Group's operations. And so it's really sort of, China has in different ways. Russia is present. The US, of course, has been for a long time. The West, through colonial sort of networks and interests, has been, even after colonialism ended in the 60s in various countries, 60s to 70s in Africa, this neo-colonial policies continued, and there were still sort of all these power games being played, like in the passage that Siddharth read out, sort of presidents of the Central African Republic were being replaced, based on the desires and whims of France. So yeah, absolutely. I think, every country has its divisions. In some countries, these divisions become fatal, turn into war, full-scale war. And I don't think that's entirely a coincidence. I think there are sort of forces that are, rendering these conflicts kind of useful. In Mexico, for example, these indigenous communities are fighting off cartels. They shouldn't be fighting off cartels, but the cartels are fighting on behalf of international, multinational companies, mining companies, logging companies. So the government wants taxes, the companies want their profits, the cartels want their protection money. So everybody's going to profit, and they're using the cartels to kind of take over these communities, open up the land. And the communities are kind of alone, fighting back. So that's another example.
And there's a new player, by the way, in Africa, with, again, in its own way colonial, looking for minerals, and that's our neighbor to the east, right?
China. Yes, yeah. China is very much so, very much active. And unlike India, sort of China uses its embassies, has a state-led policy to sort of create all these huge infrastructure projects, and in return get access to minerals and stuff like that. To your question about war, I think that there's certainly an element, at least in the first book, as a young man, as a young person, as 22 years old, there's a sense of adventure that's present. But I think over the last sort of 20 years reporting on conflict, I think what stayed with me, that sense of adventure went away. I described it in Stringer. It sort of leads to some kind of, you imagine some kind of journey, but very quickly it goes away, that romantic idea. And I think what stayed with me over the last 20 years is what I mentioned to Siddharth previously, was that in each of these places, which are barely reported on, you find really truly inspirational characters, really incredible people who don't need to be doing this kind of defense work, whether it's environmental defense, community defense, protecting their constituencies, their religious constituencies, like this abbot was. They really don't need to be taking these kinds of risks, but they're really, really incredibly inspirational. In the Central African Republic, one of the scenes at the end, close to the end, Louis and I, we drive into this church, and as we arrive, the government, the soldier, he he tells the nun that there are 3,000 people taking shelter in the church grounds. And the soldier, as we're driving in, he tells the nun, who's this Italian nun, he tells her, if all these people are not gone tomorrow morning by 8 a.m., I'm going to come in and kill everybody. And this nun basically, I ask her, are you going to leave? Because they're going to kill you. And she says, no, how can I leave? And so we spend the night there with her. And she's sheltering, the soldiers say that she's sheltering these rebel fighters. That's why they're going to, they want everybody to be evacuated. But we call the embassies and they say, 3,000 people, thousands of people are being killed every day. Why should we protect these 3,000 people? We can't do anything. And then in the middle of the night, so we decided to stay there and report on what happens the next day. We would hide in the toilets or something. And then the at midnight, Louis knocks on my door and he says, he told Human Rights Watch that we were here and that there was going to be a massacre in the morning. Human Rights Watch called the White House. The White House, in the middle of the night, located the faction of the army that was going to commit this massacre and said, 3,000 people, whatever, anything happens to our guy, you're in deep shit. And so the army didn't attack the next morning. And the US government basically called peacekeepers from the next town in armored vehicles were sent to our church to protect the church so that these 3,000 people didn't need to leave. And only then did we leave. But it's sort of one person's life was more important than 3,000 or thousands of people, right? But I guess the figure I was coming to was this Italian nun who decided to stay, decided to protect her people. She broke down crying when she understood what had happened because 3 months before, 180 people had been massacred. She'd called the Pope, and Pope said, I can't do anything. So the 180 people were massacred. And then it turned out one American guy who had showed up there, that was enough, and that stopped everything. So she kind of realized the world we live in and how different lives are valued and how the geopolitics play out. And it played out for us in a very sort of visceral way. But yeah, I think figures like her, figures like these indigenous defenders, they're risking their lives for the collective interest, and they happen in these this happens in these conflict zones. And I think what really draws me is sort of I find when I'm serving them, which is what I try to do with my books and my articles and speaking up about their causes. Now I've started to get them legal assistance and all kinds of other help. But when I'm serving them, I feel like I'm doing something useful, and that feels necessary, and it drives me to continue to in Mexico to seek out more communities and try to use the media to help them in whatever way I can. There's legal help, there's all kinds of help, but the simple act of writing about these communities, because they're not represented in the local media, even in Mexican media. So just writing about them internationally suddenly makes people wary. It becomes more complicated for somebody to attack them, to kill them. And so, media has great power in that way. Yeah.
Good evening. You just mentioned in your talk that the Indian journalists are barely present in regions where there are international crimes happening, right? What are your thoughts on the fact that if this continues, what is going to be the impact on a political, cultural, social, and economical level in India? How do you think it's going to pan out? What are your thoughts?
Well, I just think that we've come to a point where we have to stop complaining about the West. Western institutions, Western structures, Western media have their biases. They are racist, they are colonial, all these problems exist. But I think we just have to start building our own things, and that's not going to. That I don't mean to say that an international media system built by India or international foreign correspondence that's conducted by India will be perfect. There'll be huge flaws, but at least instead of complaining about someone else, then we have to deal with our own issues and our own biases, our own racism, our own prejudices. We'll have to deal with them. We'll be criticized for them, and I think that it's going to become essential. That's what I would say. I think India, if it wants to. Its interest to be represented, say, in climate negotiations, in any political way, you do need the media to represent your interests, represent your worldview, and that's just not happened. I don't know why. It's just not seen as a priority, I think. We're very inward focused, very focused on our own territory, and even something that happens, maybe in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Pakistan, it's quite complicated to get any kind of sustained reporting, even for neighboring countries.
So from a journalistic point of view, are you saying that in India, the news that is given importance is based on the percentage of readership, or is it to do with a lot of political interference? Would you be able to comment on that?
So I'm not an expert on Indian national news, but I would say that the international news that is consumed in India is, comes, a lot of it comes with a Western filter.
All right.
Yeah, that's my expertise. And so I haven't, reported on India for a while. So I couldn't, but from what I understand, there is a lot of political interference here, but I think a lot of countries.
All right, thank you.
We have a couple more questions. Just before that question, I just wanted to add something that I thought was important and came up in the context of what you just said. And that is, with the new entrant, China, and this is my own experience from the few trips that I've made in the last 1 year to different parts of Africa, is the immediate responses that I've heard it from several people that you are our more natural ally, right? For various reasons. Indians. Yeah. That's right. Right. Of course, I have only been to the old British colonial parts of Africa. If I went French, I don't know, but so natural allies, right? And that's because they've seen the exploitative nature of some of the Chinese investments. That's not to suggest that Indian investments or Indian participation in the local economy will be free of that bias. But I thought I'd just add that as.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's many Africans have said to me, we have huge cultural ties. There's so many Hindi words in Swahili, Arabic words in Swahili. They've looked east for so long, and so they to the Middle East, to South Asia, so they don't understand why India doesn't pay more interest. There's so much social capital that could be exploited.
Absolutely. Sorry, there's a question here.
Thank you. This has just been such a mind-blowing conversation to listen in on. So thank you for sharing so many stories. I'm looking forward to reading your book. You mentioned a few times about the abject poverty that these rebel groups and the communities are all facing, including trouble with health. So I have two questions. If you're witnessing that much of death, destruction, the condition of mental health must be at another level altogether. And you mentioned about not having medications for malaria, not having access to simple medications. Recently, MSF pulled out its, medication aid vertical completely, which used to supply medications to various parts of the global south. So I can only imagine the crisis will deepen across the whole world right now. So one part is about healthcare services in these war-torn areas. Who provides it? The second is about journalists facing mental health issues. So COVID brought to light the issue of mental health trouble with journalists who work and report on the front lines. And I don't know how someone like you makes sure that you stay healthy and bring the stories out for the rest of us to be able to learn.
That's a good question. I guess the first question, I think it's a consortium of NGOs. Unfortunately, there's very little infrastructure. Even if the infrastructure exists, it gets destroyed really fast. It's MSF, really brave doctors. In the Central African, one of the scenes in this church, actually, with the 3,000 people, it was Louis, me, and a couple of MSF doctors, and interesting conversations with them. But you find them in the corners, and they're treating both sides. They're treating all sides of the war. They're unbiased. So it's really, it's really courageous work, and I think necessary work. I guess, for journalists, it's only recently that we've even begun to talk about the mental health of journalists. Somehow, for myself, I found it, I don't know if it was just luck, but all my books are memoirs, and I write about myself. And I think this is actually, it was recently pointed out to me by someone from the Dart Center at Columbia University, who runs the Dart Center, Bruce Shapiro, and it's for trauma and journalism. And he said to me that writing about yourself, it's therapeutic because you see yourself as a character. So I'm writing these books and I'm seeing, oh, this happened to Anjan, that's happened to Anjan, this, he saw this, and then he went there, and then he felt this. And it's really, that's the process of therapy, where you take some distance from your feelings and you're able to assess it, analyze it, give it some meaning, give it some sense, and then you move on. So somehow I've been doing this for the last, 15 years. So, I got lucky, I think, and it's the form of the memoir allows me to process what I'm living through and allows me to continue my work. I wasn't aware of this in a conscious way until Bruce said this to me in a talk. I was at Yale, I was speaking at Yale, and a student asked me the same question, and I said, to Bruce, why don't you answer the question, because you deal with so many journalists. And he said this, and it really sort of struck a chord, rung true to me. But in Mexico, I'm traveling with a younger reporter who's 28, 29. And he's still at university. He's a Mexican student of journalism. And we're traveling around the country. And I think it's really interesting how, for his generation of journalists, these questions are far more present. Every place we go to, he sort of asks me, aren't we triggering this person by asking them about their experience? So all this stuff. And so we have these long, these indigenous communities are really isolated. And so we have long drives, 4, 5, 6 hour drives to get sort of these long sort of ethical conversations before, where he's sort of questioning the whole field. I find them really interesting, and I'm working on a book about Mexico, and it's, these conversations, this relationship with this reporter is going to be a part of the narrative, where I think, it's really essential now that journalism starts to think about these things and, face these questions, not only for journalists, for the practitioners, but also for the people we talk to. What is our, duty of care to these people? How do we take care of these things? And how do we do our work in a sort of more caring, empathetic way?
Yeah. Hi. I have a question which applies to the rest of the world, but more specifically to Africa. Has religion changed allegiances? You had tribal agglomerations, and tribes would get together on certain issues, and they differ on certain other issues. Has that changed because of religion? We're seeing the examples you gave of the Christian versus the Muslim. You could have Muslims and Christians of the same tribe. Mm-hmm. Has that tribal allegiance changed into a religious allegiance? Has it affected how people live their normal lives? They're now separated by religion. Earlier they were separated by tribe, or they found their tribes. Has that changed? We're seeing it around the world. We see it in Bangalore. So I was wondering if it's
I guess
that you see in Africa as well.
I guess I can speak to my experience. So I'm not, can't speak to religion globally, but in the indigenous communities that I'm reporting from Mexico, they're multi-religious, multi-ethnic. It's really their community that sort of unites them. Some of them, their faiths are different. They have different beliefs and all kinds of things. But their identity, if you want to call it a tribal identity, indigenous identity, unites them. And it's interesting. A lot of them see their identity, land, and language as inseparable. And when I show up in these communities, the first question they ask me when they see me, because they see I'm not Mexican, and my reporting partner is Mexican, but he's completely white. And they'll ask me when he goes to the bathroom, they'll ask me, is he Mexican? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, his mother also? And they're like, yeah. And for me, they'll ask me, what language do you speak? And so I say to them, oh, I'm Tamil, and I speak Hindi also. And they're like, oh, you speak your indigenous languages. And they're like, do you have your ancestral land? And I say, yeah, I know which village I come from. We have our little property there. And they're like, oh, you have your language and your land, you're like us. And they don't have that complicity with Rafa, my reporting partner. Yeah. But yeah, in Africa, it's kind of similar. It's language sort of holds people together, communities together. And, religion, not so much. They can be multi-religious. In the Central African Republic, religion is a divide, because in the Central African Republic, they see the Muslims as migrants, as, they've come in from, which is, from Sudan and, Darfur, and which is, historically inaccurate, but that's how they see them. And they see them as, there are also these pull people, they're nomadic, cattle herders, and they travel across the Central African Republic. So there's this narrative that even though it's completely false, that the Christian population is the native population that has been here for a long time, and that the Muslims are from the outside. And so that's why the ethnic cleansing narrative, once the Muslims took over the country, it took hold super fast. There was no radios like in Rwanda. There was no broadcast on the radios, but immediately they felt threatened. They felt the Muslims were rising. Immediately, everybody knew we got to get rid of these people. And everybody was united. It was, on this.
Which is why I asked the question that you had allegiances based on tribes, which now changed to allegiances based on religion.
Yeah, I'm not an expert actually. I shouldn't, comment on. But somehow these communities were, yes, they were separated. They did live in harmony. There was a role for the Muslim traders. They had a lot of capital. They imported, exported. So they had their role. But as soon as they became a political threat, they got, it was clear.
So firstly, thank you for bringing these stories to the forefront. My question is essentially on how social media has changed the game for conflict journalism. So do you think that it sort of created a counter-narrative where we're destabilizing the colonial news structure? Because anyone can be a journalist right now. And we've seen that in both in Palestine and in Ukraine. So
I think it's really important. I think, social media is a total it's a chaos. You get useful information. I think what's useful about it is stories surface there. So when Ukraine was invaded, when Russia started bombing Ukraine, I heard first on social media because my friends were there and they were tweeting out that the sirens have begun, and this was a few hours before the first news reports were published. So you get timely news. You get maybe access. A lot of journalism starts with rumors. You hear somebody saying something, you're not sure if it's true, and then the journalist has to go there. Usually it's a local journalist, has to go there, verify it, and then it becomes news, so-called news. So social media to me is one more avenue where people can speak up, where you can hear these voices. I wouldn't say it's changing the colonial structure yet, because somehow the way lives are valued and measured still continues to be in this very colonial structure. So maybe it's playing a role, maybe it can in the future, but it hasn't done that yet, in my opinion. Exactly. They're influenced by advertising, they're influenced by where the money is. And so that's mostly in the West, so those views get prioritized. So it's really complex to sort of shift the whole worldview. But I think, it's useful. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so my question is also kind of about the colonial structure. So when you're kind of covering stories in places that are overlooked, do you kind of find that leads to the changing or the challenging of reporting norms? Or do you more so feel like you have to kind of fit these places and stories into the established norms to get them published?
That's a good question. I think more in the news. The news that I'm writing for often, unfortunately, there aren't that many, Indian or Asian news outlets that are interested in this kind of news. So the news outlets I'm writing for are mostly Western. So I have to, frame my story sometimes as they see the world, or at least in relation or in reaction to that. I have to assume that as a given. In even pitching the stories, it's complicated otherwise. Sometimes editors have said to me, what are you pitching? Like even editors who like me, what is this? They just don't get it. And then I send the same story to somebody in Asia and they're like, I've been waiting 5 years for somebody to write this. So it's a very different perspective. But I feel like I have more liberty and more freedom in my books, which is still, again, there are colonial forces or pressures, but less so. There's also less commercial pressure. Books, nobody writes books to make $1 million unless, there's a very few, small handful of people who do. But generally speaking, you don't. So the commercial pressures are fewer or lower. And I think there's also that translates into greater freedom. Even if my editors are Western, I can push there's often a sense that even in book publishing, it's interesting, in magazines or in articles, you're very much serving the editor. The writer is serving the editor. The editor sort of is the power. In books, it's very different. The editor serves the writer often. And so the writer has a lot of authority, a lot of power to sort of push the narratives that they want. So I find books are useful for that.
You know, there's one last question. Okay, we'll take that. Do we have time, Sandhya? All right, great.
I have 2 questions if there's time.
Okay.
So one.
Keep that as short as possible, please.
So yeah, so you pivoted a lot when you were young, right? You studied in IIT and then you went to the US and then you left your job to go into journalism. So I was wondering what was the driving force for all these decisions at such a young age?
I guess, and your second question? Or? You had 2 questions.
You can answer this.
Okay, I guess, I don't know, I guess the short answer, because we're short on time, I went to Rishi Valley, so I studied in Rishi Valley a few hours from here. So I guess in some way, my relationship with authority is sort of shaped by, Krishnamurti and just sort of, even my teachers, they were like, don't trust us, you only trust what you've learned for yourself, what you know to be true. We don't have the answers. And it was very sort of, we would tease our teachers. That has its pluses and minuses, but yeah, I think a relationship with, the information and the path that you receive is shaped from a young age. Sort of, you ask yourself, do I want to do this? And I really loved mathematics when I was doing it, and I loved sort of studying for IIT. And then I was at IIT, and then I didn't understand why everyone was still competing. We got in. We're supposed to have fun now. But no, everyone was still sort of super hardcore. And I didn't understand this. And so I left. And I studied mathematics, which I enjoyed. And it was only when I was graduating when I had to think about what kind of life do I want to live. And the life of a mathematician didn't seem exciting. Being a mathematician at a bank didn't seem interesting. And so, yeah, I had this other sort of, at that point I thought I would just go to Congo for a few months. But then, that's how these things start. There's a little voice that says, maybe you'd like to do this. And so I went to Congo thinking I'd be there for 3 months or something. And then it became 20 years, I'm still doing this. Yeah.
Nice, thanks. Okay, so the second question is so you talked a lot about interacting with indigenous communities. And there's a thing to be said because we are like a huge society and interact so much. We unlock innovation so fast, right? Like in healthcare and across other advances. So I'm sure like healthcare wise, like they won't have access to say malaria drugs and all. So what kind of values do they live by, right?
It's super interesting. That's the only time in all the indigenous communities that I've reported on, the only time when I feel that they regret not having money is when somebody's sick and they need to go to the city and they need to access some crazy, high-tech healthcare that they know can save the person that they love, but they don't have the money for it, so they're like collecting through their networks. That's the only time that I really feel that they think, we're stuck. I see them really sad. I see them, get depressed. But every other moment, there's no question. I see no question for them that they feel that their life, the way that they live, which has a sort of more symbiotic relationship with their land, with their ecosystems around them. There's no question in their mind that this is a better way to live. And they're not against technology. They have cell phones, they have cars, they have TVs, satellite TV and all that sort of stuff. They just don't think it's worth destroying, 80% of our biodiversity or whatever it is to get that and to continue to consume nature in that way, in that sort of obsessive way. They just see that it has to be more sort of sustainable. And so, yeah, this is kind of, I guess, one of the main values. There has to be, if you're going to extract, you can't extract to destroy what you're extracting from.
So when you did say you have a book in the pipeline. Today was on Africa and war days. There's already another session on in terms of your indigenous and the work with the indigenous, that issue.
Yeah, there's a lot to say.
Next year, perhaps, or if not sooner.
Well, don't hold your breath. It takes a while to write these books.
All that remains now is for, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating evening.
Thanks for having me.
And we hope to see you back and perhaps talk about the first book and your new book. Thank you so much. Thanks one and all. Thank you.